No aid was coming. Every Allied ship was too far away, every distress signal unanswered, and the enemy fleet was closing in for the kill. The defenders had already accepted their end. Then, from the empty void where nothing should have been, a single human warship tore through space like thunder given form. Engines burning brighter than any star in that sector. Weapons already hot, and the galaxy watched something it had never seen before, humanity arriving exactly when everyone had stopped expecting them. We had written them off. The human ship was too far. Reinforcements would never arrive in time. Their species was still too young, too scattered to matter in a battle of this scale. We watched our own fleet close in for the finishing blow, and then the sensors screamed. A human warship, one ship came out of the void with impossible speed and fury. We had expected silence. Instead, we received humanity. The Cathari supremacy had a philosophy about war. It was not a philosophy built on hatred or cruelty. They were not a cruel species by nature. It was built on something colder and more practical than cruelty. It was built on efficiency. The Cathari had studied 500 years of interstellar conflict and arrived at a conclusion that they considered mathematically sound. The fastest way to end a war before it started was to demonstrate, clearly and immediately, that the cost of resistance exceeded any possible benefit. Not brutality. Messaging. The colony ships were not military vessels. Everyone knew this. The Cathari knew it. Their fleet commanders had reviewed the manifests, confirmed the civilian classifications, noted the presence of families, of children, of the particular demographic profile of a species in the early stages of expanding outward from its home system, hopeful, underprepared, moving toward a future they believed in. They struck them anyway. 3 colony ships, bound for the Kepler Reach, a region of space that the Cathari had decided, quietly and without announcement, was their territory now. The ships carried 4,212 people. The attack lasted 11 minutes. The Cathari fleet withdrew cleanly, leaving nothing behind that could be recovered, no signal that could be traced. It was, from a purely operational standpoint, a successful demonstration. The message was clear. This region of space is ours. Come here again, and we will do this again. Calculate your losses, weigh your options, and come to the table. They expected humanity to negotiate. 3 days later, President Addis Sunnan stood at a podium in Geneva in front of the assembled press of 12 worlds and read 431 names. She read every one. Not summaries, not age ranges, not statistics, names. The name of each person who had been on those 3 ships and had not survived. She read them in alphabetical order slowly, with full pronunciation, pausing between each one. It took 4 hours and 22 minutes. The galaxy watched. They did not understand what they were watching. The Cathari diplomatic attaché monitoring the broadcast sent a report to the Supremacy High Command. The human leader is making an emotional display. This is a grief response. Expect formal communication within 72 hours, proposing preliminary negotiation. He was watching the same broadcast as everyone else. He was not seeing the same thing. Captain T.O. Rail received his deployment orders 48 hours after the broadcast ended. He was in his daughter's hospital room when the message came through. Mira was 7 years old and had been in that hospital for 11 months, fighting something that the doctors described in careful clinical language, and that Rail had spent 11 months translating into the simpler language of "we are doing everything we can." She had his eyes and her mother's stubbornness and the particular quality of sick children who have decided that being sick is not the most interesting thing about them. She had been teaching herself origami from a book she had gotten from the hospital library. The book was missing its back cover and 3 of the instruction pages, which meant she had invented the missing folds herself and produced results that were structurally creative, if not always faithful to the source material. She was making a crane when he got the orders. He read them. He read them again. He looked at his daughter folding paper with the focused expression of someone solving an important problem. "Do you have to go?" she asked, without looking up. She always knew. "Yes," he said. She folded the last fold and held the crane up and looked at it critically. It had an extra wing. She had added one. "Will you come back?" He looked at her for a long moment. "I will do everything I can," he said, which was not the same as yes, and she was 7 and she knew that. And she accepted it the way children accept true things from people who love them, with the particular grace of someone who would rather have the truth than a comfortable version of it. She handed him the crane. He put it in his chest pocket. He shipped out the next morning. The Cathari expected negotiation. What they received, 73 hours after President Sunnan finished reading the last name, was a communication from the United Earth Command. Not a negotiation request, not a proposal for talks. A single document, 8 pages long, delivered in fluent Cathari diplomatic language that the Cathari's own linguist spent 30 minutes verifying was grammatically and culturally flawless, before admitting that a human team had produced it. The document said 3 things. First, that humanity acknowledged receipt of the Cathari's message. Second, that humanity's response would be delivered within 7 days. Third, that if the Cathari moved any additional assets toward any region of space containing human vessels or installations during those 7 days, the response would be delivered immediately instead. The Cathay High Command read it twice. They found it interestingly worded. Not aggressive, not pleading, not the language of either side of a power imbalance. The language of people who knew exactly where they stood and had decided what they were going to do about it. The attached intelligence report, compiled separately by Cathay analysts, was more concerning. In the 48 hours since the attack, every nation on Earth had quietly suspended civilian space travel. Every commercial deep space vessel had been recalled. Every system designated as non-essential had been stood down, and a number of assets that Cathay Intelligence had classified as research platforms and communications infrastructure had changed their orbital patterns in ways that suggested they were not, in fact, research platforms or communications infrastructure. The Cathay had excellent intelligence on humanity's declared military capacity. They were less certain, suddenly, about what wasn't declared. Dr. Kashar had been working on the Helioside device for 9 years. He had not been working on it as a weapon. He had been working on it as a solution to the energy constraints of long-range space travel. A method of sustained high-yield energy capture from stellar sources that could, in theory, power a fleet of colony ships for decades without resupply. It was elegant and patient and important work, the kind of work that made deep space expansion feasible for a species that didn't want to be dependent on weapons-grade power sources. He had named it Helioside because it drew energy from stars. When the orders came through, he sat in his lab at the Lunar Research Institute for a very long time. He looked at 9 years of calculations on his screens. He looked at the test results, he looked at the models. Then he called the director of UEC Research Division and said, "There's something I need to show you." The conversation lasted 40 minutes. 3 days later, Kashar was on a fast transport to the outer staging area, carrying 9 years of research and the quiet, specific sadness of someone who built something beautiful and has just understood what it will be used for. He did not think it was wrong to use it. He thought the use was necessary. He thought that was not the same thing as being fine with it. He thought about 431 names being read for 4 hours by a woman who refused to let them be a statistic. He thought about what the people who built colony ships believed in when they built them. He did the work. The Cathay fleet was impressive by any measure. 14 capital ships, 63 support vessels. The flagship ascendancy of correct thinking was 4 kilometers of articulated armor and weapons systems that represented the engineering heritage of a civilization that had been building warships for 6 centuries. Admiral HFY had commanded it for 11 years and had in that time overseen 7 successful planetary negotiations, which was the polite Cathay term for the process of demonstrating overwhelming force until the other party calculated their options correctly. On the 7th day the response arrived, not a communication. The response itself, the thing that humanity had spent 7 days preparing, emerged from the shadow of the Cathay fleet's own supply corridor, from the direction no defense grid is ever pointed because no competent fleet approaches from its own supply lines. 3 human warships, running silent, that the Cathay's sensors had not detected as warships because they had not registered as anything that needed to be a warship until they chose to be. HFY had time, in the seconds before the engagement began, to revise several assessments. The first engagement lasted 40 seconds. By the end of it, 2 Cathay capital ships were critically damaged and the fleet's communications array was no longer transmitting. Not destroyed, specifically disabled. The human ships had targeted the ability to call for help rather than the ability to fight, which HFY recognized, with a professional clarity that he would later describe as genuinely impressed, as a message: "You can fight. We have chosen not to end this yet. Decide what you want to do." He chose to fight. What followed were 47 minutes of engagement that the UEC battle analysts would later spend years studying. Not because of the outcome, but because of the method. The human ships did not fight the way the Cathay fought. The Cathay fought with doctrine, established patterns, refined through centuries, optimized for the kind of enemy they had always faced. The human ships fought with improvisation, not sloppily, not desperately. With the specific improvisation of crews who had been told to prepare for an enemy that would adapt and had prepared accordingly by training for the moment the plan stopped working and they had to invent the next one while the current one was still happening. It was chaotic and expensive and, in its own way, extraordinary. Then Kashar gave the authorization. The human ships fought with improvisation, not sloppily, not desperately. With the specific improvisation of crews who had been told to prepare for an enemy that would adapt and had prepared accordingly by training for the moment the plan stopped working and they had to invent the next one while the current one was still happening. It was chaotic and expensive and, in its own way, extraordinary. Then Kashar gave the authorization. The Cathay Nest ship was not a military vessel. This was important. HFY understood the importance immediately when UEC Command transmitted the targeting data, not the capital ships, not the weapons platforms, but the Nest ship, a vessel the Cathay kept at the rear of every fleet formation, never in combat range, never mentioned in engagement protocols, a vessel that held, among other things, the fleet's biological archive, the genetic records of every Cathay crew member, the cultural inheritance stored for species continuity purposes. The future, in the specific sense that a civilization means when it uses that word. The heliocide device activated, drew power from the nearest star, clean, sustained. The energy of a sun channeled through 9 years of Kasharen's careful mathematics. The beam was not large, it was precise. It targeted a specific section of space, not the nest ship's hull, but the space immediately in front of it. The region it would have to cross to reach any escape vector, a wall of light. We know what this ship carries, the UEC transmission said. We know what it means to you. You have 30 seconds to withdraw your fleet from this region of space. The device will remain active for 30 seconds. You will not be harmed if you withdraw. Threshviakoran looked at the wall of light on his display. He thought about the colony ships. About 4,212 people. About a broadcast he had watched because his own intelligence briefings required it. A human leader reading names for 4 hours because she refused to let the dead become a number. He thought about the Cathari philosophy of efficiency, of messaging, of demonstrating costs. He had not understood. He realized that his fleet had just received the same message he had sent, not brutality. Messaging. We know where you keep the things you cannot lose. We are choosing not to destroy them. We are choosing to give you 30 seconds. This is what we do with the power we have. He withdrew. The war ended in stages, the way most things end, not all at once but in pieces, as decisions made at great height worked their way downward to the level where people lived. Captain Tio Rail came home. Myra was 8 by then. She had a new origami book, one with all its pages, and had decided that the 3-winged crane was better anyway and continued making them. She was sitting in the doorway of their building when he came up the street, and she ran the way children run when they are certain of being caught. He held her for a long time. He took the crane from his chest pocket and showed it to her. She looked at it critically. It survived, she said. It did, he said. She considered this, then she took it back from him, gently, and held it in both hands with the specific care she gave to things that had been somewhere important. I'm going to make you a better one, she said. One that flies right. He looked at her. The one I have flies fine, he said. 3 months after the ceasefire, President Sunnan met with the Cathari delegation in a neutral station orbiting a star that neither species had claimed. The meeting lasted 6 days. What came out of it was not the negotiated settlement the Cathari had expected, not the careful calibration of acceptable losses and territorial adjustments that their philosophy of efficiency suggested. Was the logical conclusion of the engagement. What came out of it was a conversation about the names. The Cathari delegation had watched the broadcast. Every one of them. They had watched a human leader spend 4 hours reading the names of 431 people who were dead because of a decision made in a room none of them had been in. They had watched, and their intelligence analysts had told them it was a grief response, a display, a performance of emotion that would resolve into negotiation. They had not understood that reading the names was the negotiation. It was saying these were people, not a number, not a calculation. People with names, each distinct, each worth the full weight of 4 hours of someone saying them out loud. And we will not pretend otherwise to make the mathematics of your offer more palatable. Admiral Threshviakoran, who attended the diplomatic sessions in a secondary capacity, requested a copy of the broadcast after the ceasefire. He watched it alone, in his quarters, in full. He did not reach the same conclusions his analysts had reached. He reached a different one. They count their dead. He wrote in the private journal that his family would read decades later. Every one, by name. However many, however long it takes. They do not allow the number to become just a number. I have conquered 14 planetary systems. I have never once counted the names. He closed the journal. I should have. He wrote, and for the first time, the galaxy understood not that humans were invincible. Not that they were the strongest or the most advanced or the most ancient, but that they were the kind of species that, when someone tried to make their dead into a message, got up in front of the universe and made them people again instead. 431 names. Said slowly, with full pronunciation, every single one. If this story moved you, subscribe for more human stories from the stars.